lawyer's office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. I sat in a cracked leather chair, watching Mr. Pemberton shuffle through documents with liver-spotted hands. Outside, Portland's grey October sky matched my mood perfectly. "Your Uncle Henry left everything to you, Mr. Ashford," Pemberton said, sliding a folder across his desk. "The lighthouse at Harrow Point, the keeper's cottage, and approximately $12,000 in a savings account." I hadn't seen Uncle Henry in 15 years. The last time was at my mother's funeral, where he'd stood apart from the family, silent and weathered like driftwood. We'd exchanged maybe 10 words. "I didn't know he had a lighthouse," I said. "He was the keeper there for 37 years, quite dedicated to his duties." Pemberton's expression flickered with something I couldn't read. "The property is remote, very isolated. The county has been trying to automate it for years, but Henry always refused to leave." I took the folder. Inside were deeds, bank statements, and a hand-drawn map showing a thin finger of land jutting into the Atlantic, connected to the mainland by a narrow causeway. "What are my options?" "You can sell it, though I'll warn you, the market for lighthouse properties is limited. Or you could occupy it yourself. There's a small stipend from the Coast Guard for maintaining the light." He paused. "Your uncle's body was found at the base of the tower. The coroner ruled it a heart attack, though he was only 68. Quite sudden." I thought about my empty apartment in Boston, the divorce papers I'd signed 3 months ago, the job I'd quit because I couldn't stand my boss's face anymore. I had nothing waiting for me, nowhere I needed to be. "I'll check it out," I said. "See what condition it's in." Pemberton nodded slowly. "The keys are in the folder. And Mr. Ashford, if you do stay there, even for a few days." He trailed off, then shook his head. "Never mind. Just be careful. It's very isolated." The drive to Harrow Point took 3 hours. I followed the coastal highway north, watching the landscape grow increasingly desolate. Towns became villages, villages became scattered houses, and finally, there was nothing but pine forest and glimpses of cold ocean between the trees. The turnoff was easy to miss, a gravel road marked only by a weathered sign that read, "Harrow Point Lighthouse, private property." I followed it for 2 miles, through dense woods until the trees suddenly opened up, and there it was. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, white tower stark against the grey sky. The keeper's cottage was attached to its base, a small square building with peeling paint and dark windows. Beyond it, the Atlantic stretched to the horizon, restless and iron-colored. What struck me most was the causeway, a single-lane road of packed dirt and stone connecting the point to the mainland. Water lapped at its edges. According to the tide chart in the folder, it would be completely submerged in 4 hours. I drove across slowly, feeling the isolation settle over me like a weight. This wasn't just remote. This was the edge of the world. The cottage door stuck before finally scraping open. Inside, everything was neat but spare. A small kitchen with ancient appliances, a living area with a wood stove and a single chair positioned to face the window. One bedroom with a narrow bed. The walls were bare except for a calendar from 2 years ago and a framed photograph of the lighthouse circa 1890, based on the clothing of the people standing in front of it. Uncle Henry's presence lingered in the smell of pipe tobacco and the tidiness of someone who'd lived alone for decades. I found his clothes folded in the dresser, his toiletries arranged precisely in the bathroom. It was like he'd just stepped out and would return any moment. The tower itself was accessible through a door in the cottage. I climbed the spiral staircase, my footsteps echoing off stone walls. The lamp room at the top housed an enormous Fresnel lens surrounding an oil lamp mechanism. Everything was immaculately maintained, the brass fittings polished, the lens spotless. From this height, I could see for miles. The causeway looked even more precarious from above, a thin line that would vanish entirely when the tide came in. I was already starting to feel trapped. Back in the cottage, I searched for information about managing the lighthouse. I found operational manuals, maintenance logs, and Uncle Henry's meticulous records of weather conditions and beacon lightings. Then, in the desk's locked drawer, which I had to force open with a screwdriver, I found a letter addressed to me in my uncle's handwriting. Thomas, if you're reading this, I'm dead, and this burden has passed to you. I'm sorry. I looked for another way, but there isn't one. The lighthouse needs a keeper, and it chose you. I know how this sounds. You'll think I went mad out here, alone for too long. You'll dismiss what I'm about to tell you as the ravings of a senile old man. That's what I thought when the previous keeper, Garrett, left me his letter. But you'll learn. God help you, you'll learn. Follow the rules exactly. Don't improvise, don't skip steps, and don't convince yourself they're just superstition. They were written in blood over more than a century, and every word matters. The light keeps them out. Miss even one night, and you'll understand why you can't leave. I'm sorry, Thomas. I truly am. Henry. Beneath the letter was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. At the top, in different handwriting than my uncle's, were the words, "Rules for the keeper. Light the beacon every night at exactly 8:47. No earlier, no later. Never look directly at the water after midnight. If you hear knocking, count the knocks. Answer only if there are 3. Keep all windows shuttered between 2 and 4. The radio will broadcast static most nights. Do not attempt to find voices in it. If you see someone standing on the rocks, they are not real. Do not go to them. Never let the light go out before dawn." I read the list 3 times, waiting for it to make sense. The specific time, 8:47, was oddly precise. The rest sounded like the kind of urban legends teenagers told at sleepovers. I checked my phone. No signal, of course. I'd noticed a landline in the cottage, but who would I call? What would I say? Hi, my dead uncle left me a haunted lighthouse with a list of crazy rules. It was 6:30. The sky was already darkening, heavy clouds rolling in from the sea. I looked out the window at the causeway and saw with a start that it was gone, completely submerged beneath churning water. I was stuck here until morning. Fine, I'd humor Uncle Henry's delusions for one night. Then I'd leave at low tide and never come back. At 8:45, I climbed the tower stairs with a box of matches from the kitchen. The lamp mechanism was complex, but Uncle Henry had left detailed instructions. I had to pump a handle to pressurize the oil reservoir, then adjust several valves. The wick needed to be precisely positioned. I checked my watch. 8:46 and 30 seconds. Something about the specificity of 8:47 nagged at me. but I'd committed to following the rules. At exactly 8:47, I struck a match and lit the wick. The flame caught, grew, and suddenly the Fresnel lens blazed to life. The beams swept across the darkness in a slow, steady rotation, illuminating the rocks below and the restless ocean beyond. I stood there for a while, watching the light sweep round and round. There was something hypnotic about it, something ancient and purposeful. I understood why someone might find comfort in this ritual. Eventually, I descended to the cottage. I made dinner from supplies I'd brought, canned soup heated on the electric stove, and tried to settle in for the night. The isolation was profound. No traffic sounds, no neighbors, nothing but the constant rush of waves against rock. Around 10 o'clock, I heard something scratch against the window. Just a branch, probably. Except there were no trees within 50 yards of the lighthouse. I told myself it was the wind. At midnight, I was in bed but unable to sleep. The beam from the lighthouse swept through the bedroom window every 30 seconds, painting the walls with moving light. In the darkness between sweeps, I heard the ocean clearly, the crash and hiss of waves, rhythmic and endless. Rule number 2 drifted through my mind. Never look directly at the water after midnight. It was absurd. What harm could looking at water do? But I didn't look, despite my skepticism, despite my rational mind insisting this was all nonsense. I kept my eyes away from the window. The night passed slowly. I dozed fitfully, jerking awake at unfamiliar sounds, creaks in the structure, the groan of the tower in the wind, things that might have been footsteps on the rocks outside. When dawn finally came, grey and cold, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The causeway reappeared as the tide receded. By 9 o'clock, it was passable again. I stood at the threshold of the cottage, car keys in hand, looking at that thin strip of land connecting me to the mainland. I should leave, drive back to Portland, list the property with a realtor, and forget this place existed. But something made me hesitate. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that I had nowhere else to go, nothing else to do. Or maybe it was Uncle Henry's letter, that note of desperate sincerity. I'd stay one more day, look through his things, understand what his life had been like out here. Then I'd decide. I drove to Gravesend, the nearest town, 15 miles down the coast. It was the kind of place where everyone noticed a stranger. I felt eyes on me as I parked on Main Street and walked into the general store. The shopkeeper was a man in his 70s, with a face like weathered granite. He watched me gather supplies: coffee, bread, canned goods, batteries. "You're at Harrow Point," he said as I set everything on the counter. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "Only the place around here isolated enough that you'd need this much food." He rang up the items slowly. "You're Henry's nephew. Thomas, right? He mentioned you once or twice. You knew my uncle." Everyone knew Henry. Good man, dedicated to his work. The shopkeeper, whose name tag read Bill, gave me a long look. "Your uncle knew what he was doing out there. Hope you do too." "What does that mean?" Bill handed me my change. "Means Harrow Point has been keeping a light for 140 years. There's reasons for that. Your uncle understood the reasons. And what reasons are those?" But Bill just shook his head. "Not my place to say. You'll figure it out, or you won't. But if you're staying out there, You follow Henry's rules, all of them, exactly. The way he said it sent a chill through me. This wasn't one old man's eccentricity. Bill knew about the rules. Did other people follow these rules? Every keeper since the lighthouse was built. Them that didn't? He trailed off, then busied himself straightening items on the counter. Drive safe. Tide comes in fast this time of year. I left with more questions than answers. On the drive back, I watched the ocean rolling endlessly against the shore and tried to ignore the feeling that something was watching me from beneath those waves. That night, I lit the beacon at exactly 8:47 again. This time, I paid closer attention to the process, noting how the oil lamp created a specific frequency of light, how the lens focused and magnified it. This wasn't a modern electric beacon. This was 19th century technology, maintained precisely as it had been built. Why hadn't they modernized it? The Coast Guard could install an automated system that would run for months without human intervention. Why insist on a keeper? I thought about Bill's words. There's reasons for that. At 11:30, I made tea and sat in Uncle Henry's chair by the window. The beam swept past rhythmically, illuminating the rocks in flashes. Between sweeps, everything disappeared into darkness. That's when I saw it. Just for a moment, in the edge of the beam's light, something moved on the rocks. Too large to be a seal, wrong shape for any animal I recognized. Then the light moved on, and I was staring at darkness again. I waited for the next sweep. The rocks were empty, but I'd seen something. I was sure of it. Midnight arrived. I remembered rule number 2, and this time the urge to look at the water was almost overwhelming. What could possibly happen? It was just ocean, just water under moonlight. I stood up, walked to the door, stepped outside into the cold night air. The beam swept overhead, and in its light, I saw the rocks, the spray of waves, the endless Atlantic stretching to darkness. Everything looked normal. I walked to the edge of the point, where the land dropped away to sharp rocks and churning water below. The next sweep of the beam was coming. I had maybe 10 seconds of darkness. Never looked directly at the water after midnight. The rational part of my brain screamed that this was ridiculous, that I was letting an old man's paranoia infect my thinking. But something deeper, more primal, told me to turn around and go back inside. The beam passed overhead. In its light, I glanced down at the water. At first, I saw nothing unusual. Just waves breaking against rock, foam white in the darkness. Then I noticed that the water between the rocks was perfectly still, while waves crashed and surged all around. One section, maybe 20 feet across, was smooth as glass. As I stared, something moved beneath that smooth surface. Something large, something that shouldn't exist. I saw what might have been a limb, too long and with too many joints. I saw what might have been a face, too wide and with eyes that reflected the lighthouse beam like an animal's. I saw movement that made my brain hurt, trying to process it. Geometry that shouldn't be possible in 3-dimensional space. Then the beam moved on, and I was staring at darkness again. I ran back to the cottage, slammed the door, locked it. My heart hammered in my chest. I backed away from the windows, pressed myself against the far wall. What the hell had I just seen? I stayed like that until dawn, too terrified to move. listening to the ocean and the slow revolution of the light above me. Morning brought a fragile sense of rationality. In daylight, I could almost convince myself that I'd imagined it, that my exhausted brain had conjured monsters from shadows and water. Almost. I spent the day exploring the cottage more thoroughly, looking for answers. In the bedroom closet, I found boxes of Uncle Henry's belongings. Most were mundane: old clothes, books, tax records. But at the bottom of the last box, wrapped in oilcloth, I found older documents. Lighthouse logs dating back decades. I spread them on the kitchen table and began to read. The entries were sparse, mostly noting weather conditions and maintenance tasks, but occasionally there were other observations. January 15th, 1998. Keeper Garrett notes increased activity around the rocks, recommends additional vigilance during winter months. March 3rd, 2001. Something tested the door at 3 o'clock. Shutters held. July 22nd, 2009. Peterson gone. They found his boat empty 3 miles offshore. No body recovered. That last entry made my blood run cold. Who was Peterson? Another keeper? I kept reading, finding more references scattered through the years, mentions of the things below, notes about keepers who'd left or disappeared, and repeatedly emphasis on the rules. Must maintain exact lighting schedule. Cannot deviate. Uncle Henry's entries began in 1988 and continued until a week before his death. His handwriting, neat at first, became shakier over time. September 2nd, 2024. They're getting bolder. Got too close to the rocks tonight. They know I'm old. They're waiting. September 18th, 2024. How long do I have? Need to find someone to take over. Can't let the light fail. October 3rd, 2024. Contacted the lawyer. Thomas is the only option. God forgive me for this. The final entry was dated 4 days before his death, October 20th, 2024. Heart is failing. Can feel it. But I must keep the light burning. Just a few more nights. Just until Thomas comes. I sat back, hands shaking. My uncle hadn't died of natural causes. He'd held on, keeping his duty, until arrangements were made for his replacement. For me, the sound of an engine pulled me from my dark thoughts. I looked out to see a car crossing the causeway, the realtor I'd contacted during my first confused day here. I'd completely forgotten about the appointment. Her name was Patricia something, a cheerful woman in her 50s who chatted about property values and development potential as I showed her around. She loved the rustic charm and the stunning ocean views. She thought it could be turned into a bed and breakfast, maybe a tourist attraction. I imagined tourists here, families with children, people who wouldn't know about the rules, who would look at the water after midnight and answer every knock at the door. Actually, I said as we stood in the lamp room, I've decided not to sell. Patricia's smile faltered. Oh, you're planning to stay. For now, it was my uncle's home for a long time. I'm not ready to let it go. She left looking disappointed, her car receding across the causeway as the afternoon tide began to rise. I watched until she disappeared into the tree line and felt the isolation close around me again. This place didn't want visitors. It wanted a keeper. Night 5 brought the knocking. I'd followed the rules precisely. lit the beacon at 8:47, avoided looking at the water after midnight, kept to myself. At 2 o'clock, I shuttered all the windows as instructed, plunging the cottage into dimness, broken only by the sweep of the beacon through cracks in the wood. I was sitting in Uncle Henry's chair, listening to the ocean, when I heard it. Knock, 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 knock. 4 deliberate strikes against the front door, each one solid and purposeful. I froze. Rule number 3. If you hear knocking, count the knocks. Answer only if there are 3. 4 knocks. I shouldn't answer. I stayed silent, hardly breathing. The lighthouse beam swept overhead, its rhythm steady and reassuring. The knocking came again. Same pattern. 4 times. Then it moved. I heard it on the east window, then the west, then somewhere above me. It circled the lighthouse, always 4 knocks, always methodical and patient. Something was out there, testing every entrance, trying each door and window in sequence. I thought about what I'd seen in the water, those wrong shapes moving beneath the surface. Were they the things knocking? What would happen if I answered? The knocking continued for an hour, moving around the structure in a pattern I couldn't predict. Sometimes it was loud enough to rattle the frames. Sometimes it was gentle, almost polite, but always 4 knocks, never 3. At 3:47, I heard something new, a scraping sound, like something rough being dragged across stone. It came from outside the shuttered windows, moving slowly around the cottage. I pressed my eye to a crack between the shutters. At first, I saw nothing. Then the lighthouse beam swept past, and I glimpsed something on the rocks below. Her shape, roughly human-sized, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It moved in starts and stops, like a film with frames missing. The beam moved on. Darkness returned. When the light came back around, the shape was closer to the cottage, closer to me. I jerked away from the window, heart hammering. Through the crack, I heard it breathing, a wet rattling sound that shouldn't come from anything living. Then, at exactly 4 o'clock, everything stopped. The knocking ceased, the scraping ended, the breathing faded away. I stood in the silent cottage, shaking for several minutes before I dared to open the shutters. Dawn was still 2 hours away, but the normal night sounds had returned. Waves, wind, the creak of the tower. Whatever had been outside was gone. At first light, I went outside to look for evidence. The rocks around the cottage were wet with spray, but I found scratches on the door that hadn't been there before, long gouges in the wood, like something had dragged claws across it. I was done lying to myself. This was real. I drove to Gravesend and went straight to Bill's store. He was arranging vegetables when I walked in and took one look at my face before gesturing me to the back room. "You saw them," he said, not a question. "What are they?" Bill sighed and poured coffee from a pot that looked older than the building. "Don't rightly know. Nobody does. They've been there since before the lighthouse was built. Longer, probably. The old keepers called them different things. The drowned, the deep ones, the things below. Names don't matter much. Why do they come to the lighthouse? Because we're there. Because we're warm and alive, and there." He shrugged. "Something else. The light keeps them at bay, but they test it every night, looking for weakness, for mistakes. And the rules. Learned over time. Keepers who broke them usually didn't survive to write about it, but patterns emerged. The knocking, for instance. 3 knocks are safe. That's other keepers. On the rare occasions someone visits. 4 or more means something else is asking to be let in. This is insane, I said, but the words felt hollow. Why don't people know about this? Why isn't the government involved? Oh, they know. Coast Guard's known for a century at least. But what are they going to do? The things stay in the water. They don't attack anyone who follows the rules. And that lighthouse has kept them contained for 140 years. Why risk changing things? So I'm just supposed to stay there forever? Bill's expression was sympathetic but firm. You're the keeper now, Thomas. Your uncle passed the duty to you. And once you've lit that beacon, once you've stayed through a full night, the place has a hold on you. You can try to leave, but what? The lighthouse needs a keeper. It'll do what it must to keep one. I left the store, feeling like I was drowning. Back at Harrow Point, I paced the cottage, trying to think of options. I could just leave, get in my car, and drive away. What could a lighthouse do to stop me? But I remembered Uncle Henry's letter. The light keeps them out. Miss even one night, and you'll understand why you can't leave. What would happen if I didn't light the beacon tonight? Would the things in the water come for me? Or would they be released somehow, free to spread beyond this isolated point? I thought about the town of Gravesend, 15 miles away, about Bill and his store, about ordinary people living ordinary lives, protected by something they didn't even know about. At 8:47, I climbed the tower stairs and lit the beacon. Night 6 brought the figure on the rocks. I saw her while performing the lighting ritual. Through the lamp room windows, illuminated by the first sweep of the beam, a woman stood on the rocks below. She wore a white dress that moved in the wind, and her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. She looked up at me, and even from this distance I could see her face clearly. She was beautiful. She was terrified. She raised one hand, reaching toward the lighthouse, her mouth open in what might have been a scream. Rule number 6. If you see someone standing on the rocks, they are not real. Do not go to them. But God, she looked real. She looked like someone who needed help, someone stranded or injured, crying out in the darkness. I descended the tower stairs, my mind at war with itself. The rational part knew this was a trick, a lure. But the human part, the part that wanted to help, that couldn't stand seeing someone in distress, pulled me toward the door. I stood with my hand on the handle, listening to the wind and waves. The woman made no sound that I could hear, but I knew she was still out there, still waiting. I opened the door. The cold hit me immediately, wind carrying spray from the ocean. I stepped out onto the rocks, searching for the woman. The lighthouse beam swept overhead, and in its light, I saw her, perhaps 50 feet away, still reaching toward me. Up close, something was off about her. Her movements were too smooth, like she was swaying underwater instead of standing in wind. Her dress didn't move quite right, and her face, while beautiful, had a quality I couldn't name. Something uncanny valley, almost human but not quite. I took a step towards her, then another. She smiled at me, and I saw that her mouth was too wide, stretching farther than should be possible. Behind her teeth, I glimpsed darkness that went down and down. I stopped walking. We stood there, 50 feet apart, watching each other. She kept smiling that impossible smile, kept reaching with hands that had too many fingers, kept swaying in that underwater motion. The lighthouse beam swept between us, and each time it passed, she was subtly different. Closer, though I hadn't seen her move. Her features rearranging themselves, trying different configurations, testing which one would make me take another step. "You're not real," I said out loud. "You're not human." Her smile widened further, splitting her face nearly in half. Then she opened her mouth and screamed, a sound like nothing I'd heard before, like metal scraping on metal, mixed with drowning gurgles and the cry of some deep-sea creature that never should have surfaced. I ran back to the cottage and slammed the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the lock. Through the window, I watched her stand on the rocks for another hour, patient and still, before she finally turned and walked into the ocean. She didn't sink. She just kept walking, disappearing beneath the waves as if descending a staircase into the deep. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I went to the basement, a place I'd been avoiding because Uncle Henry had always kept it locked. I'd found the key in his belongings, but hadn't worked up the nerve to go down there. The stairs were steep, the walls closer than in the rest of the cottage. At the bottom, I found a small room with stone walls and a dirt floor. Most of it was storage, old equipment, spare parts for the lamp mechanism, barrels of oil. But in the far corner, behind a stack of crates, I found a loose stone in the wall. Behind it was a metal box, sealed with wax. I broke the seal and opened it. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and water-stained, with pages yellowed by age. The first entry was dated May 2nd, 1887, written in careful script. "Construction of the lighthouse is complete. I, Samuel Harrison, have accepted the position of keeper. The pay is modest, but the solitude suits me. This will be a good life." I flipped through the pages, watching Samuel's journal entries progress from mundane observations to growing unease. May 30th, 1887. Saw something in the water today. Too large to be a whale. Didn't surface again. June 15th, 1887. The locals in Gravesend won't speak plainly, but they fear something in the waters off Harrow Point. Old fishermen called it the Deep and made a sign against evil. When I pressed him, he said only, "Mind the light, keeper. Don't let it fail." August 3rd, 1887. They come at night. I've seen them on the rocks, shapes that hurt to look at directly. The light seems to keep them at distance. I must research the optical properties of the lens. September 12th, 1887. I understand now why this lighthouse was built. Not to warn ships away from the rocks. There are no shipping lanes here. It was built to keep them in, to keep them down in the deep where they belong. The entries became more sporadic, more desperate. November 8th, 1887. One of them spoke to me tonight, used my dead wife's voice, calling from outside the door. I did not answer. I will never answer. January 19th, 1888. I am compiling rules for my successor. I will not survive many more years of this, but the duty must continue. The light must never fail. The next pages contained the original version of the rules, nearly identical to the ones I'd found. Samuel had refined them over months of terrible trial and error. His final entries were brief. March 2nd, 1888. I have written to my nephew. He will come when I am gone. God forgive me. March 6th, 1888. The first keeper made a deal with something to keep them contained. I don't know the terms, but I feel the weight of it. This lighthouse doesn't just employ keepers, it binds them. Once you've lit the beacon and stayed the night, the place has a claim on you. You belong to it, as it belongs to you. There is no leaving, not truly, only passing the burden on. The journal ended there. I checked the historical records I'd found earlier and learned that Samuel Harrison died in April 1888. His nephew, Robert Harrison, became the second keeper. The pattern was established. Uncle after nephew, keeper after keeper, for 140 years. And now it was my turn. On the seventh night, I decided to test it. I'd spent the day in a fog of denial and anger. This couldn't be real. I couldn't be trapped here by some supernatural compulsion, bound to a lighthouse through eldritch contract I'd never agreed to. I was a free man. I could leave whenever I wanted. So I would prove it. I would not light the beacon tonight. I would let it stay dark, and I would watch what happened. And then I would leave this place forever. As 8:47 approached, I stood in the lamp room with matches in my pocket, watching the seconds tick by on my watch. 8:47. I did nothing. The sun had set an hour ago. Darkness pressed against the windows. Below, the ocean surged against the rocks, and I thought I saw movement in the water. Many things circling, waiting. 8:48. Still no light. My hands itched to strike a match. Some deep part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I was breaking something fundamental. But I resisted. 8:50. The first knock came at 8:53. Not on the door, but on the tower itself, somewhere below me. Then another and another, a rising cacophony of impacts against stone and wood. They were climbing the lighthouse. I heard them on the stairs, their wrong footsteps echoing in the spiral shaft. Wet sounds, scraping sounds, the click of things that might have been claws on the metal railing. The door to the lamp room bulged inward. I ran to the mechanism and with shaking hands began the lighting sequence. Pump the oil reservoir, adjust the valves, position the wick. The door was splintering. Through the cracking wood, I saw movement, shapes that writhed and pressed, trying to force their way in. Something that might have been an arm, too long and with joints that bent the wrong way, reached through a gap in the door. I struck the match. The lamp ignited, and the Fresnel lens blazed to life. The beam swept outward, and the things on the stairs shrieked, that same metal scraping sound I'd heard from the woman on the rocks, multiplied 100-fold. The arm withdrew. The pressure on the door ceased. I stood there gasping, watching the beam make its steady revolution. Outside the windows, I could see them retreating down the tower, dropping to the rocks, some moving like spiders, others flowing like liquid. They fled into the darkness beyond the light's reach, and one by one, they slipped beneath the waves. The ocean swallowed them up, and the night returned to its usual rhythm of wind and waves. I sank to the floor, my heart hammering. The message was clear. The light had to burn. Every night, at exactly 8:47, without fail. This was my duty now. This was my life. I tried to leave the next morning. The tide was out, the causeway clear. I packed my bags, loaded my car, locked the cottage door. Everything a sensible person would do when ending a stay in an inherited property. I made it halfway across the causeway before my car died. No warning, no sputtering. The engine just stopped. I tried to restart it, but it wouldn't even turn over. The battery was fine yesterday. Everything was fine yesterday. I got out and looked under the hood. Nothing obviously wrong. The car should work, but it didn't. I stood there for a long moment, looking at the lighthouse behind me and the mainland ahead. 500 feet of exposed road between captivity and freedom. I started walking. I made it another 100 feet before I felt it, a pressure in my chest, a tightness that grew with every step. My heart began to race. Sweat broke out on my forehead despite the cool morning air. The world swam in my vision. Another step. The pressure increased. It felt like a heart attack, like my chest was being crushed by an invisible hand. I looked back at the lighthouse, standing white and implacable against the gray sky. The lighthouse needs a keeper. I turned around and walked back. With every step toward Harrow Point, the pressure eased. By the time I reached the cottage door, I could breathe normally again. I tried again an hour later, with the same result, and again at noon. Each time, I made it a little less far before the crushing pressure forced me back. The sun was setting when I finally accepted the truth. I wasn't leaving. Not today, not tomorrow, maybe not ever. I called my friend David from my old life using the cottage's landline. He answered on the third ring. "Thomas, where the hell have you been? I've been trying to reach you for days." "Sorry, no cell service out here." My voice sounded distant, hollow. "Out where? What's going on?" I started to tell him about Uncle Henry, about the lighthouse, about the things in the water. But halfway through, I realized how it sounded, like the ravings of someone having a breakdown. David would insist on coming to get me, and I couldn't let him come here, couldn't risk him breaking the rules through ignorance. "Never mind," I said. "I'm just dealing with estate stuff. It's complicated. Are you okay? You sound weird." "I'm fine. Just tired. I'll call you later." I hung up before he could ask more questions. I stood in the cottage, looking at Uncle Henry's things around me, understanding him now in a way I never had before. He'd stood in this exact spot countless times, trapped by duty and circumstance, held by an agreement made long before his birth. How many nights had he lit the beacon year after year, while his life passed by in isolation? How many times had he wanted to leave but couldn't? How many years had he known he was growing old, that he'd need to find someone else to take his place? On his desk, I found the letter he'd written to me. I read it again with new understanding. "I'm sorry, Thomas. I truly am." He'd known exactly what he was condemning me to. At 8:47, I climbed the tower stairs and lit the beacon. My hands were steady now, the ritual already becoming automatic. The lens caught fire and blazed, sending its warning out into the darkness. Below, in the water, I saw them gathering as they did every night, waiting, patient. They would always be there, I realized, for as long as I kept the light burning, for as long as I was the keeper. 3 months have passed since I inherited the lighthouse. Winter has settled over Harrow Point, with cold that cuts through walls and wind that never stops. The causeway is passable maybe twice a week now. The tides are higher, the storms more frequent. Sometimes I go days without seeing another human being. I've fallen into routine. Wake at dawn, maintain the equipment, monitor the fuel supply, light the beacon at 8:47. Follow every rule exactly. I know them by heart now. Light the beacon every night at exactly 8:47. No earlier, no later. Never look directly at the water after midnight. If you hear knocking, count the knocks. Answer only if there are 3. Keep all windows shuttered between 2 and 4. The radio will broadcast static most nights. Do not attempt to find voices in it. If you see someone standing on the rocks, they are not real. Do not go to them. Never let the light go out before dawn. 7 simple rules. The only thing standing between the deep and the world above. I see them more often now, in daylight as well as dark. Shadows beneath the water, shapes in the fog that watch the lighthouse and wait. They test the boundaries every night, probing for weakness, for hesitation, for the moment when I might fail. But I won't fail. I can't. I tried staying in Gravesend once, about 6 weeks ago. Told myself I'd just spend one night away, sleep in a real bed, eat a hot meal at the diner. But I woke at 3 with my heart hammering and a certainty that something was wrong. I drove back through darkness and storm, barely making it across the causeway before the tide came in. The relief I felt when I saw the lighthouse standing intact, the beacon burning steady, was overwhelming. The lighthouse calls me back, always. I've started keeping my own log now, continuing the tradition of keepers before me. Sparse entries, noting weather and maintenance, with occasional observations about the things below. One day, someone else will read these entries and try to understand what their life has become. That realtor, Patricia, called a few weeks ago, said she had a buyer interested in the property, someone who wanted to turn it into an artist's retreat. I listened to her pitch, imagining painters and writers coming here, people who wouldn't understand the rules, who would see them as quaint superstition. I told her the lighthouse wasn't for sale. It will never be for sale. Some nights, when the knocking comes, I sit in Uncle Henry's chair and think about him, about Samuel Harrison before him, and all the keepers stretching back through the decades. We're linked by duty, by burden, by the terrible knowledge of what lurks in the deep. We're the watchers, the guardians, the ones who keep the light burning. Tonight, the wind is picking up. There's a storm coming in from the Atlantic, and I can feel the lighthouse sway slightly in the gusts. But the beacon is ready, the fuel is full, and I check my watch, 7 minutes. I'll climb the stairs and light it. Because that's what I do now. That's what I am. I'm the keeper of Harrow Point Lighthouse, and I will keep the light burning every night at exactly 8:47 until I'm too old to climb the stairs, until my heart gives out like Uncle Henry's did, until I find someone else desperate enough, alone enough, lost enough to take my place. The duty passes on. It always has. It always will. Because the alternative, I've seen it, climbing the tower, wearing stolen faces, reaching with too many fingers. I know what happens if the light goes out, and I will never let that happen. 6 minutes now. Time to climb the stairs. The beam must shine. The deep must be contained. This is my purpose, my prison, my life. The light keeps them out, and I am the keeper of the light.